Welcome back to the Solid Verbal boys and girls. My name is Ty Hildenbrandt, that fine gentleman over there. As always, you know him. His name is Dan Rubenstein. Sir, welcome back to the show. How goes it?
Yeah, I mean, it's terrific, Ty. I get to learn about another team well in advance of the season when roster's already pretty much locked in. We'll see what happens in the fall with any sort of transfer intentions anyway. But I'm getting a jump on learning about teams that I was going to deep dive in the summertime. So this is great. And especially a team I'm always pretty interested in. I'm terrific, Ty.
Man, I am fascinated by NC State.
Yeah.
I am fascinated. Today we're talking NC State with Cory Smith of PackPride.com. We have been titling these episodes, Will It Ever Happen for So-and-so? USC, Penn State, Tennessee, Nebraska. This concept has NC State written all over it, frankly.
Yeah.
Because the Wolfpack, solid team.
Mm-hmm.
Truly a solid team under Dave Doeren. 11 years in Raleigh, 9 winning seasons. Notably, though, Dave Doeren has never finished a season with more than 9 wins. Today, I think we're going to chat about why that is, how close NC State is to getting over that proverbial hump, breaking out, et cetera, et cetera. So we're excited to have Cory on here. If you're just joining us for the first time, hit follow, hit subscribe, wherever it is you're consuming this podcast. That ensures you get all of our episodes. If you really like what we do, verballers.com is where you can go to sign up for the Patreon, get these episodes a little bit early without the ads. You also get bonus perks like our Discord server, et cetera, et cetera. But this will be a good show. I am excited to talk about NC State today, Dan.
Hey, sorry for the quick interruption, but it'd be incredible if you considered subscribing to the Solid Verbal YouTube channel right down below. Oh, yeah, and NC State's especially fascinating. You look at the past few years, and it's just you want to win a bunch of games with very limited quarterback talent and very limited quarterback production or very limited offensive pop, but still find ways to win. And I think NC State kind of owns Florida State in recent times. They've won 5 of 6 or something. They're Dave Doeren is kind of a wizard for all of his deficiencies, for all of whatever you perceive NC State's weaknesses to be. They, by and large, win a bunch of games. They lose some games. And they do so with having random star power on the roster, which I want to ask Cory about. But to do it with a mix of, Devin Leary into MJ Morris, but MJ Morris decides to redshirt, and Brennan Armstrong transfers in and doesn't have a lot of pop, doesn't have a lot of receiver. And it's a fascinating way to win, which I think is a compliment to what this staff has done in Raleigh.
The other thing that I think goes unmentioned when we talk about NC State.
Yeah.
NC State's a big place, Dan.
It's
a big school. It's the biggest school in the Carolinas.
Mm-hmm.
Yet in terms of the football program, rarely, if ever, are they truly part of that national, quote unquote, national conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So much is changing in college football, not the least of which is the expanded playoff. There are now new teams in the ACC. There are other teams maybe trying to break up with the ACC. NC State finds itself in a really, really interesting spot for a whole multitude of reasons. Today, hopefully, we can explore why, again, with Cory Smith from PackPride.com. If you are just tuning in, if you're just finding us, we did this episode a couple times over now, talking about a variety of schools. I mentioned them earlier, from USC all the way through to Nebraska. Encourage you to go and check those out. Learn something new about a bunch of these programs that you just know we're going to be talking an awful lot about here, at least through the early part of the season when everybody's got hope and is undefeated and expectations are at their highest. So we're going to keep doing this, I think, for the next couple episodes.
Yeah.
If you want to send in any suggestions for teams that we should focus a little bit more on, our email address is solidverbal@gmail.com. And of course, Dan, you can always follow us across all of our social media platforms.
Yeah, by the way, one of the things we talk about with NC State before we get into Cory is sometimes places win and coaches win, teams win, but there are certain places that no matter the coach, they're going to win 8 or 9 games. Tom O'Brien won 8 or 9 games. Chuck Amato, which, by the way, sunglass revolutionary with the wraparounds, Chuck Amato. And certainly Dave Doeren winning 8, 9 games. So there is something about NC State that is just this is a winning place. And, everybody's going to have their down years or down stretches or whatever. But, if you can't consistently win at NC State, that's a you thing. That's not a school thing, because this is a place that is, geographically in a good place, obviously attractive for assistants to come to. It's one of the better places in college football for sure.
Shall we dive in with our guest of honor?
Let's.
From the Pack Pride website and podcast, very pleased to welcome for the first time to the show, Cory Smith. Welcome to the Solid Verbal, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. Appreciate you guys having me on. It's always fun to talk football, especially, we're about to ramp up with baseball, but man, it's a great time to talk about football, especially for NC State.
So here's what's fascinating to me about NC State, and Dan and I just talked about this a little earlier. It is not a situation that, like we've referenced before at Penn State, where they're consistently outclassed by the same teams in their conference every year. NC State's had a lot of success against Clemson, against Florida State over the last couple seasons. Over the last 5 years, though, a bunch of their losses have come against teams that they're either good enough to beat or in games that are close enough to win. Is there a popular theory as to why this team is solid enough to win 8-9 games a year, but still inconsistent enough to lose one or two of those winnable games each season?
Yeah, I think it's the parity in the ACC. For NC State, it's not to say they get up for the big games and, they prepare for those, but I think it's a case-by-case basis. They lost a couple to Wake Forest back when, Wake Forest was a good team, not a great team, but, a team that consistently Dave Clawson was able to beat Dave Doeren, and that was an issue. There was multiple seasons where NC State could have won 10 games, and they lost to Wake Forest in those years, and one of them happened to be a 6-7 Wake Forest team, so it wasn't even a good one. And then they've done the same thing, whether it was losing to Clemson multiple years straight. They've won 2 out of the last 3, but there was several years where they could have gotten over the hump if they had just beaten Clemson. So beating Clemson, beating Florida State consistently, and now they beat Wake Forest this past year. The hope is to be able to kind of move past that at this point. So if they're able to do that, I think that can help to kind of propel them to that next tier that they're trying to get to.
We have a big enough sample size at this point with Dave Doeren. Is it like a Dave Doeren thing? What is the source of that inconsistency, if not a parity issue, which we've obviously seen develop over the years in the ACC?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have tried to say it's all on Dave Doeren, and at times it can be, whether it's not stepping up in the big moments at times. They've kind of lost some games in the fourth quarter. I think back to, Miami back in 2020, which was a weird season altogether, but that's one of those games that they put that game away and suddenly they're in a different area. Whereas, this past year, it was just a weird one. They couldn't quite figure out what was going on the first 5 games of the season. They move on from Brennan Armstrong and they go to MJ Morris. It was a weird situation, but they found a way to kind of win the last 5 games of the season and salvage the season. Whereas, that led to hopefully what is to come this year. So, yeah, it can be a Dave Doeren issue at times, but I think it's also just a matter of, kind of missing some of these, lesser game situations and not being able to be ready for those.
What is the current status? I guess the most recent status of quarterback has been, you mentioned the MJ Morris thing, going back and forth, Brennan Armstrong, now Grayson McCall transfers in, and there are some high times with some of Devin Leary's time. Certainly Ryan Finley had some great moments. What are the vibes right now within the program or within the fan base about where NC State stands at quarterback?
Well, I think at this time last year, the hope was, hey, keep MJ Morris as a red shirt. Brennan Armstrong, this is your season. Learn Robert, show everybody what Robert and I's system is all about. And then MJ Morris is supposed to come in the next year and be the guy. First of all, he had to come in last year. Brennan Armstrong was not good for those first 5 games. MJ Morris comes in. He's good, but not great enough to lead them to the wins. And then obviously the whole redshirt situation, if you don't know about it at this point, he played 4 games, decided to redshirt still for the last 3.
Yeah.
It was, not a great look. He transfers. He's at Maryland now. But, there is another guy that was waiting in the wings in Cedric Bailey, whichever one you want to call him, coming up from Florida. Chaminade Madonna was where he was at. People might recognize that. Jeremiah Smith happened to be one of his wide receivers. He was notched down a little bit because it was like, oh, man, you're throwing to him and Josiah Trader, 2 guys that are, one's a 4-star wide receiver going to Miami. The other one's a 5-star, the top overall recruit in the country going to Ohio State. So he was knocked down a little bit as like, hey, he's just more of a game manager. but he's 6'6", a little over 200 pounds now. They're still trying to put some weight on him to get him prepared for that next stage, but he looked really good in the spring game. Everything we heard out of spring camp was he has a chance to be the future guy. I still think they probably bring in a transfer for next year, but as of right now, that's kind of where the quarterback situation is going. And obviously Grayson McCall is Grayson McCall. They expect him to be the guy this year and lead the team to where they're trying to get to. But CJ Bailey is probably the future of the program right now.
I'm wondering, and I don't know if this is the correct term, but I'm wondering what the state of star power is on the NC State roster. And you look, however you want to evaluate that, but NC State certainly was more successful in the NFL draft, going back 5-6 years ago, highlighted by, I think, Bradley Chubb was the 2018 draft. And when you're comparing NC State to their schedule, which we can get to, it's pretty favorable this year. What is the state of star power, high level, all ACC caliber talent on this roster if they are going to make a move, especially this year, bringing in Grayson McCall and having a good amount of stability, doing well in the portal? What is the state of that right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think Grayson McCall, if you're talking all ACC, I don't know that you put him necessarily first team before the season starts, but he has a chance to be, first team, second team guy this year. Again, if you're talking about NFL star power, maybe Grayson McCall isn't the guy. He's, fifth year quarterback. He's had his chance to be, looked at by NFL teams. I don't know necessarily if he will again this season, but another guy that I'm keeping a really close eye on, if you want to talk about star power and somebody that could seriously emerge, Jordan Waters, that came over from Duke at the running back position. He was excellent for Duke for the last several years. He was also a former wide receiver that I think probably wants to be able to be utilized a little more in the passing game. So he's a guy that I think has a chance to be a big star this coming up year for them. Another one, Noah Rogers. We talk about QB Concepcion. I think a lot of people know who that is at this point. He's already being tabbed as a potential first rounder in the 2026 draft, if you look that far ahead. Mm-hmm. So he's a guy, the next 2 years, probably the biggest NFL star power. But Noah Rogers coming over from Ohio State, we've heard a ton about his potential and what he can do for this team as well. Big body wide receiver, kind of that outside boundary receiver that you really need for this team they didn't have last year. And then Justin Jolie coming over from UConn. And this is all just, playmakers on the offensive side of the football.
Right.
But Justin Jolie coming over from UConn was the number 2 tight end in the 24/7 Sports rankings this past offseason. So he has a chance to be a big-time player for NC State as well. They kind of used him as that move tight end. If you know anything about Robert and I's system, he's done a lot with that over the past few years, whether it was at Syracuse with Oronde Gadsden or it was at Virginia with multiple guys there, several of which are in the NFL, one of which is with the Packers now at this point. So if you're just looking on the offensive side of the football, those are the guys. Anthony Belton at the offensive tackle position, I think, has a big chance to be, a big name player by the end of the season too. And then Jacarius Peak, whether you look at him as a right tackle or as a guard, he's going to play right tackle for NC State, has a chance to be, a big name. And then moving over to the defensive side of the football, Davin Van is a kid that I love. He plays the defensive end spot for NC State, but they obviously play a 3-3 stack system. So he probably projects as a defensive tackle at the next level. And then Brandon Cleveland, somebody that, I'm going to bring the name up here, and I've done it multiple times on our podcast. His stats were very close at the end of the season and his projections by Pro Football Focus to a guy like Aleem McNeil as a sophomore. When you look at the last 6 games that he played, Aleem McNeil ended up going on to the Lions. One of their, obviously, they have a guy in Hutchinson that plays that defensive end spot, but he's a key cog for them. And then the other guy really, if you're talking about the defense, Aiden White is a big name to know at the cornerback position. He still has not over the last 2 years given up a touchdown against at the cornerback position. So he has a chance to really push himself into, another level in the ACC this year. I think with a lot of guys gone at the cornerback position from this past year in the ACC, he has a chance to maybe push himself for first team and try to get himself into a good spot in the NFL draft next year.
So NC State is especially interesting to me when you look at roster construction. You rattled off a number of names who are high-level ACC players. Dave Doeren does not recruit on like a typical top 30, 35-ish national level. That's sort of, it seems like, has been his ceiling over the past few years. And while they're active in the portal, they're not overhauling a roster in the portal. They're not, Louisville. They're not, what Texas A&M has lost and tried to add. They've been sort of measured, I would say, in the portal, going after very specific guys. how do you evaluate the sort of strengths and weaknesses of NC State's roster construction and retention, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably one of the only weaknesses that they had this past year was not going out and getting another linebacker. They got a guy in Wyatt Wright that comes over from the JUCO level. I think he can add a lot of depth to this team. We'll see if he starts. And then they move Sean Brown, who is at safety, down to linebacker as well. So we'll see, if he's able to fit that role as well for NC State, what they want to do. But you lost Peyton Wilson. You lost another linebacker as well that was a starter from last year, but most people know Peyton Wilson. Jalen Scott was the other one that they lost from last year. So you needed depth there. They didn't really go out and identify that. That was the one big loss. And then they went out and got Cam Riley from Auburn. He decommits and goes to Florida State at the last minute right after the portal closes. So that was, a great
That's
look
brutal.
for NC State, what they're trying to go out and get. But yeah, I mean, I think as far as the strengths are concerned this past offseason, I would say it was at just about everywhere else. I mean, the biggest thing they needed to do this past offseason was go out and get some experience at the wide receiver position. They had Casey Concepcion that came back. They lost a few that were, from last year's team, but multiple that went to kind of lower level schools that,
Right.
weren't really cutting it for NC State. So like I said, they went out and got Noah Rogers. Another name to know, Wesley Grimes, they went out and got from Wake Forest. He was kind of their third receiver, and he'll probably fill that role for NC State as well. But we talk about recruiting as much as we talk about the transfer portal and all these guys that I've shined a light on. Terrell Anderson's one that came in. It was a top 100 player. NC State doesn't get a ton of top 100 players. The last few that they've gotten were guys like Ricky Person that ended up playing a pretty big role for them. Ali McNeil that I mentioned earlier, Peyton Wilson. When they get top 100 guys, those guys end up being pretty big hits for them. And then, like I said, Terrell Anderson, and then you go out and get a guy like Jonathan Paylor that South Carolina wanted really, really bad. NC State's able to pull him away at the last minute. He's another top 150 guy that'll play a little bit of running back, wide receiver. So they went out and got a ton of playmakers, like I pointed out. I think that's kind of where I would evaluate the strengths for NC State. Again, they needed top end guys at the quarterback position like Grayson McCall and Jordan Waters. They went out and got that. You filled all of your needs, and then they went out and got, some experience that they really wanted for this upcoming offseason to be able to kind of push themselves in that mix of not only trying to contend for an ACC championship, but trying to put themselves in the conversation for a college football playoff with it expanding to 12 teams.
Cory, specifically on Grayson McCall, obviously really fun player, playing for Jamie Chadwell and his system at Coastal Carolina. Almost transferred, I believe, before last season, had the new coach, ended up getting hurt, clearly was not his best campaign. What is your sense for how he fits into that Robert and I offense? What does that look like, perhaps as compared to some of the other quarterbacks that have come through recently, most notably what we saw last season?
Yeah, I'm not going to throw shade at anybody because obviously Tim Beck is the former offensive coordinator for NC State, but
Yup.
I don't really think it was a great fit for Grayson McCall in that system. We saw, Devin Leary was more of a, kind of a game manager quarterback, obviously had some really big plays, but Grayson McCall is more of a gunslinger. He's more of a guy that's going to try to throw the ball deep down the field. You got to give him some opportunities, and you got to put more playmakers around him. He didn't have those this past year. And again, right. I keep going back to the well of having a ton of playmakers, but Robert and I in his system loves to be able to use guys in a variety of ways, whether it's using Jonathan Paylor, as we mentioned before, as a guy that they kind of use on the end round situation. You might have some of those pop passes like we saw Brennan Armstrong be able to have a ton of success with in the last season with Casey Concepcion being able to use him in that role. So I think with all the guys they've added in this system, with the protection that he has, there's also 4 starters coming back from last year at the offensive line spots, and then you add Zeke Correll at the center spot that comes over from Notre Dame. He had an injury bug in the spring. We didn't get to see him, so hopefully he'll be healthy for the fall and be ready to go. But that's kind of the big thing for NC State is not only going out and getting a quarterback, but truly building around him. And I think that was what they didn't do this past year in Brennan Armstrong. It was like, all right, we got Brennan Armstrong. He's going to be our guy. He knows Robert and I's system. They're going to make it work. The defense is going to be our strong suit. We're going to be good enough to win the ACC championship. They went out this year and did the exact opposite. They bolstered the offense around Grayson McCall. You have a chance to have him hopefully fully healthy for an entire season. Obviously, he is a bit of a dual threat quarterback, but He's a guy that's passed for over 10,000 yards in his career, 88 touchdowns. So they get a guy that has a ton of experience and somebody that I think is looking to, again, really prove himself in his final year after kind of missing out on that opportunity this past year.
I went back and looked before we brought you on at some of the efficiency numbers on offense. The last 2 years for NC State, the offense has been pretty bad in terms of things like success rates, marginal explosiveness, like some of these advanced stats that we talk about here a lot. They're still winning games, mind you, but what is the source, if you had to put your finger on anything, of that inefficiency? Is it offense? Is it a combination of factors with not having the playmakers? Is it the system? What is that thing, and what is Robert and I trying to do specifically to fix that?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of everything that you just mentioned. I mean, the inefficiency comes down to the fact that, as I mentioned before, like the loss of playmakers. I mean,
Right.
you look back to last year, the running back position in particular. I know a lot of people kind of put it on the wide receivers, but you started out the year with Jordan Houston being the number one guy. He realized after 4 games, after 3 games actually, he was not going to be the starter moving forward. They were probably going to go with other guys over top of him. He transfers out before the season even ends. The same thing happened with another running back that was boosted into that spot last year. He ends up going to UNLV. So there just wasn't a ton of depth at that running back position last year. Kendrick Raphael ended up being the best of the crop, and he was a true freshman, so he was not fully prepared. Last year compared to this year, the biggest thing I think that changes is having a little more experience. Like we mentioned all the transfers, but again, Kevin Concepcion was a true freshman last year. Kendrick Raphael was a true freshman last year. That was your number one wide receiver and your number one running back in the last 4 games of last season. That's not exactly ideal. So while, some of the issues go back to Tim Beck the previous year, it also goes back to the fact that they lost Devin Leary after 5 games. They lose MJ Morris after 2 games over the next course of the next few weeks. And then they end up going with a 4th string quarterback for the final 2 games in Ben Finley. So I don't put a whole lot of stock in the offense from 2 years ago. And I think, again, last year was not just a lack of playmakers, but even the playmakers that were your solid players, you couldn't ask for a lot of consistency out of true freshmen, despite the fact that they were able to step up. And again, hoping that the Brendan Armstrong experiment was going to work, and I don't think it did. So your hope is going into this year, the veteran guys that you have coming back, the better offensive linemen, all those guys having another year under their belt, and having a Grayson McCall that you expect to be better than Brendan Armstrong was last year, I think helps this offense in a big way.
Let me zoom out for a second. I'm curious to what degree NC State is capitalizing on this moment, because it seems like NC State athletics is sort of having a moment. Both basketball teams, men's and women's, make the Final Four. You mentioned the baseball team earlier. Baseball team at last check is consensus like top 10, top 15. They're having a good year. Football team, which we're talking about here, always pretty solid. I read your article from about a month ago, Cory, where you talked about the NIL Collective having a big night of fundraising. It seems like there's a lot going on that front. What is the state of play for NC State with respect to the money, NIL, and trying to build up that side of the program?
Yeah, I mean, the last few months have certainly helped. I mean, even the last 5 games of the football season, like, as much as it seems like, they finished with 9 wins again, but I mean, nobody, absolutely nobody, even NC State fans expected that. You started off 4-3 and you finished 9-3, and you rattle off wins at home against Clemson, at home against Miami. You go on the road to Wake Forest, which is a place that they never win, mind you. Like, going to Wake Forest has just been a house of nightmares for NC State over the years, as I mentioned earlier. And then you beat UNC. Like, to close out the season, you couldn't have asked for a more ideal finish. Dave Doeren goes out and he basically says, I want 5,000 people to give $1,000 and push us over the top, get us to a point where we can, compete in the NIL market. Don't think it quite matched those numbers, but from a football standpoint, that certainly helped too. The thing that you want now for NC State is, when we talk about the college landscape and we talk about where everything is right now, when you're talking about trying to get to new conferences, you're talking about trying to compete in the NIL marketplace, you've got to win in football too. Like, football is a big play in all of those. And it's something that moves the needle for everybody, because whether you're talking about going to the SEC, the Big 12, or the Big 10, or potentially trying to build up the ACC. I don't know exactly where that's going to head, but we'll see. You're talking about all these different things, and football's got to be a big player in that too, because as much as Dave Doeren has kind of helped to get this team to a consistent place, he still hasn't won 10 games. They still haven't won an ACC championship. So as much as you're seeing the door being knocked down by men's basketball winning an ACC championship, getting to a Final Four, the women's team, up until 2 years ago had won 3 straight ACC championships and gets to the first Final Four. 3 years ago, they had gone to the Elite Eight. So all of these teams are pushing to get NC State in those national conversations. Now it just needs football to kind of finish off the job one of these years and really kind of propel this program into where they can actually be talked about as a national figure as well.
Does that all make 2024 a sort of if not now, when kind of year for the football team? We talked a little bit about the schedule. This is an NC State schedule that misses, Florida State, Miami, Louisville, Virginia Tech. It's a pretty good foursome to miss this year, considering the upside of those 4 schools. The September schedule is tough, but otherwise it's a pretty manageable, if not favorable, schedule. You couple that with Grayson McCall's experience, the guys you mentioned coming in, the guys you mentioned, the younger players coming back, the veteran presence on this team, the expanded playoff. Is this sort of like a year NC State fans should circle with a thicker marker than usual in that sort of if not now, when kind of way?
Yeah, it certainly feels like it. I mean, you mentioned the tough schedule in September. You start off with Western Carolina, and as we were talking about, it kind of favors NC State now because they start off on a Thursday, whereas Tennessee, now mind you, it's not a difficult game, but Tennessee starts on a Saturday, and then they play the very next Saturday in Charlotte. So for NC State, you get a little bit of time off in between those after your first game. Lick the wounds, I guess, maybe from playing Western Carolina. Again, not a strong team, but you just never know what can happen in any game. You just hope you come out of that fully healthy. And then you play Tennessee in Charlotte, so not a true road game. 2 weeks later, you go on the road to Clemson. The non-conference schedule outside of Tennessee is favorable for NC State. And as you mentioned, you miss all of those ACC teams. They also, close out the season against UNC that hasn't been, seen as one of the stronger teams in the ACC. Really, the toughest teams for NC State outside of facing Clemson probably come at the end of the schedule. The only hiccup I can see for them, and we talked about this earlier, is the issue for NC State is not being able to break through and beat some teams that are beatable. They finish the season at Georgia Tech, and then you go on the road to UNC as well. So you finish off your senior day in like week 10, and then you face those 2 teams down the stretch. So for NC State, it's kind of like, all right, start the season as strong as you possibly can, push yourself into that conversation. If you can win both of those games in September, that's humongous. But you can't stub your toe on the games at the end of the season and miss the ACC championship as a result. If you win against Tennessee and you lose against Clemson, just win out the rest of the way, put yourself in the conversation to get to the ACC championship. And if you do that and you win the ACC championship, you propel yourself to the college football playoffs. So yeah, this is definitely one of those seasons where, the last 2 years we've talked about it ad nauseum. The conference realignment discussions have been going on for several years now at this point. So for NC State, it's always been like, all right, this has got to be the year. This has got to be the year. This really feels like, with the way that the movement has actually happened now, the SEC has actually added Texas and Oklahoma. The Big Ten has actually added USC and UCLA and several other teams, Colorado, Washington, all these other teams. It's like, all right, man, the ACC, several teams are trying to find a way out now. You're going to be left out of this conversation if you can't actually have a breakthrough year, and that's kind of where this is now for NC State. That's why they put so much stock into this year too.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about that, where NC State sort of stands. And, there's conversations around like it's not an if, it's a when with Florida State and Clemson. Obviously, UNC's name has come up. Virginia's name has come up with a couple different conferences. What is the feeling, the sense behind the scenes at NC State as they try to best position themselves for the future as a huge program? We've mentioned the recent success in other sports. What is the sense right now with like options or lack thereof with NC State?
Yeah, a lot of the conversations that I've heard behind the scenes over the last year or so have been, the fact that a lot of politicians inside of North Carolina want to keep NC State and UNC together. Those are kind of the 2 that are like, all right, we want those 2 to at least have success. Those are the 2 major public universities. Duke and Wake Forest, both private universities, so it's a little different conversation there. whereas the politicians want to see those two end up in great spots. Whether it's ending up together in the same place or it's pairing off with somebody like say UNC Virginia go to the Big Ten, NC State and Virginia Tech go to the SEC, that might be, the best of both worlds for the conferences, the best of both worlds for all those teams, and you try to keep the rivalry together the same way that, the SEC and ACC schools have done over the years, whether it's Florida, Florida State, or, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Clemson, South Carolina. You try to keep those rivalries together between those two natural schools. And I think it's a best of both worlds for everybody. Now, obviously, I've heard the conversations for NC State when it comes to the Big 12 as well. That's another potential landing spot. But I think, if you're looking for an ideal, landing spot for both those teams, it's getting into one of those two major power conferences. As much as the Big 12 has done to help themselves, they're still not seen as a major player when it comes to the conversations the way that the SEC and the Big Ten are right now. So I don't think it's likely that NC State lands in the Big Ten. I do see a path for, a separation for NC State and UNC. But again, I think it's more than likely pairing up with one of those teams from Virginia for both of them to end up there and give, both the SEC and the Big Ten, kind of the national or the marketplaces that you would get out of those two, the TV broadcasting that you would get in North Carolina and Virginia, which are, still pretty ideal marketplaces for both of them.
So NC State offers, whether it's the ACC, whether it's another conference, something that's pretty rare right now, which is stability, right? That NC State, outside of, was it 2019, the 4-8 year? This is a team that is a value add to the competitive nature of the ACC, that they win games, they consistently win games, they, are on bowl TV come late December, early January. What is the secret sauce? Dave Doeren has been there for a while now, and I guess the easy answer would be it's his program, it's his vision, they consistently win. But even behind the scenes, whether it's administration, whether it's how they recruit, whether it's how they hire new coaches, what is that secret sauce to NC State's stability in a pretty chaotic sport?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest things, you go back to Dave Doeren, it's him kind of feasting off of the doubt. It's him. I wouldn't say, it's similar in Dabo Swinney in that, because Dabo obviously, is hyper about it and goes above and beyond. But Dave Doeren loves feasting off of any kind of doubt that's created. Unfortunately, sometimes that doubt is after losing big games and losing games that you shouldn't lose. And all of a sudden the team, rebounds and finishes strong. But I think this year the difference has got to be, being able to kind of feast off the doubt that's there when it comes to the rest of the ACC. A lot of people are still putting Florida State, still putting Clemson ahead of them and saying, hey, we're in this conversation. We need to be, put as the number 1 or number 2 team in the ACC. And people are already putting Miami above them as well. And look, granted, Cam Ward is a great quarterback, but I think for NC State, it's like we built a complete team here. We have a chance to push for that. And I also want to give credit, too, as well, to the fact that he's brought in stability when it comes to the offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator spots. Yes, they had to change the offensive coordinator this past offseason, but, keeping Robert and I, keeping Tony Gibson, and keeping every single other coordinator or every single other assistant around them, this is exactly what they did ahead of the 2022 season when the expectations were extremely high. Now, again, quarterback injury, losing Devin Leary, losing several other guys, whether it was Isaiah Moore, Peyton Wilson that season for long stretches, that was what ultimately hurt the team. But they brought a ton of guys back, and the hope was to be able to build towards that. And we'll see if they're able to do that this upcoming season. And the last guy I want to give some credit to as well, Boo Corrigan, the AD for NC State. Debbie Yao was who hired him, but Boo Corrigan has consistently said anytime I've ever asked him, like, what's next for this program? And he's like, it's putting the program over the top. It's finding out from our coaches what takes them from good to great, and then what takes them from great to being a championship caliber team. He's been able to do that with several programs across the ACE or across NC State's program and pushing them towards where they're at in the ACC. I think now the hope is to be able to kind of push this NC State football team towards that. You saw it with the recruiting. You saw it with the transfer portal. You saw it with bringing back all the coaches. Now it's time to put it all on the field.
Cory Smith of PackPride.com, as well as the Pack Pride podcast. Final question. You set me up perfectly, actually, with your previous answer. The title of this episode is, Will It Ever Happen for Dave Doeren and NC State? It in this case, air quotes, obviously a relative thing. What does it mean to you, mean to NC State? How close is NC State to getting there in 2024 or at some point in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a three-part thing here for NC State. It, number one, is getting to 10 wins. I mean, that's only been done one time in the history of NC State. It was done under Chuck Amato, Phillip Rivers, one guy that hasn't been coaching for a while, the other guy that's been out of the NFL for 3 years now at this point. He is currently coaching his son, Gunnar Rivers, who is a top-tier quarterback in the 2027 class, if I remember correctly. So that's how long it's been for NC State. And before that, it was literally never. So the thing for NC State right now is trying to get to that 10-win, that double-digit win plateau, which they have not been able to reach since 2003. And then, the next part of that is if you get there, that probably puts you in the conversation for the ACC championship game. NC State has not won an ACC championship in football since 1979. That has not, that's even longer than what the basketball team had done, which was accomplished earlier this year. So that is it as well. And then the third one being, if you can do all those things and you can put yourself in that national conversation and put yourself inside the top 10, top 12, they're currently tabbed as number 13 by ESPN. I think a lot of our 24/7 guys have them inside that top 20. If you do all those things and you're already preseason top 15, top 20, you probably put yourself in the conversation for the college football playoffs. So those are all three things. Now, do I think NC State can accomplish two of those and not get to the college football playoff? No, because I think if you're the ACC champion, you're going to get yourself in that mix. So They have to do all three of those things in order to accomplish it. So I think this is probably the year. If you're looking for a year for NC State to do it, given the schedule, given what you've added from a talent standpoint, given what you've added from a veteran leadership standpoint, given what you've brought back to this team, whether it's the head coach, all the assistants, everybody that you've brought back, and then some of the depth pieces that you added this previous offseason, in the spring, whether it was on the defensive side of the football and then offense back in the fall. They've done all these things to build towards this year. So this is more of a if not now win because, again, as we've mentioned multiple times, you're trying to put yourself in that top tier of the ACC for not only yourself, but also for every other conference that's looking to add to their conference and looking to add to, what they can do for their bottom line. So if you're NC State, you've got to be able to put yourself from a brand marketing standpoint and from just a football standpoint right now, be able to put yourself in that conversation. So I do think it can be accomplished this year. But again, a lot of it's going to be decided in how well they do in September. You go at least 3-1 in September, win one of those two marquee games, that keeps yourself in that conversation to be able to finish out strong in the ACC and really get yourself in all those conversations.
No fewer than 17 Stanford fans will be making their way to Raleigh in early November. I guarantee it. No fewer than 17. Where should they be eating and drinking in Raleigh, which is a great place? And maybe that's why the coaches like sticking around. You win games in a warm college town. Life is good. Where should they be eating and drinking?
Yeah, obviously the barbecue in North Carolina is what it is. I mean, it's, vinegar-based on this side of the town. I would, the suggestion I would give, I think a lot of people would say Clyde Cooper's downtown Raleigh. The suggestion I would continue to give, if you're looking for barbecue, it's a small little hole-in-the-wall place, but you can get an entire plate for like $12. Is Old Town Barbecue. I love them. Medio's is where we shoot our podcasts. They're an Italian restaurant that's located right outside of NC State campus. It's a beautiful spot. They have the Hall of Fame there for NC State. It's got everything across the walls, whether it's banners or it's pictures of former players for NC State, and then massive structures they have for football fields, basketball courts, things along those lines. And the last spot that I'll give you too, it's always a staple of Raleigh if you're looking for kind of that upscale steakhouse. Angus Barn is the place to go. I'd give that, and then Sullivan's too downtown. I love both of those spots, so I don't want to give one or the other. But Angus Barn is kind of seen as like it's literally built inside of a barn type of place, and the steaks are like that thick. So it's a prime spot as well.
All right, Cory Smith, Pack Pride 247. Thank you so much for all of your time, all of your insight, and I am more excited. NC State has to come through for me now. I'm now more invested than I thought I'd be in the Wolfpack. Thank you very much for all of your time.
Appreciate you guys.
All right, Dan, there you go. Cory Smith. Check him out at packpride.com on the 24/7 network. Also listen to his podcast, Pack Pride Podcast, where they talk more NC State sports. I said it at the top. I feel even stronger about it now. I am fascinated by NC State. And I'm a little bit worried because you know me. I fall in love with teams. I fall in love with schedules in May. And I carry that through the entirety of the regular season. I'm a little bit worried that NC State could be that team for me, or one of those teams for me this season. I've already committed to the bit with Virginia Tech. I'm on the fringes of doing so with NC State as well, because I like what they've done in the portal. I've always liked Grayson McCall. The schedule is, you said favorable, I'll say beautiful. It feels like, as Cory mentioned, it is a now or never moment for this program to get to that 10-win plateau, and who knows what happens if they do.
Can I zag for a moment?
Please.
In researching what I wanted to talk to Cory about, I realized that NC State has had 2 Finley quarterbacks playing in Carter Finley, and I couldn't find a definitive answer if those Finleys are related to Albert Finley from the early 20th century.
Right.
And now it's driving me a little bit crazy. And you just don't see that in college football. Quarterbacks with the same name as the stadium, and I appreciate that, Ty. I don't know where I'm taking this exactly, Ty, but it's one of those things that just hit me, and I was like, that's fun. No, actually, Carter Finley is one of those places when I was doing the old SI show, I always tried to figure out a way to get to and was never able to in the tailgating series, and still remains on my list as a place that if and when I'm able to pick up my ability to travel 2 games once again, 100% on the list.
Do you know what? Well, I'm sure there are many, but one of Carter Finley's, the stadium's, claims to fame.
No. Did you do a TikTok about this?
I did way back when.
All right.
I haven't done it recently. I'm not going to lie and say it was the most exciting one.
It's okay.
That I've ever done.
We'll make it exciting.
But Carter Finley opened in, I want to say, the 60s, if memory serves. I'm digging back through
somewhere in there. Yeah.
Through the archive here. They had, at the time, what was considered an innovative and pioneering lighting system. Okay. And they built it specifically in a way that wouldn't blind you if you were in the stands, which was way ahead of its time, right? Yeah. Lighting technology's come a long way. We talk about the laser thing that they do at Alabama and elsewhere.
Right.
In the 60s, they didn't have any of that, but they did have a problem with the lights blinding the people who were actually there. So not only was it easier to watch the games in person without having the lights shining on you, but because the lighting was better, it made it easier to broadcast the games then in color.
Oh, I like that.
Way ahead of their time.
You know how I feel about lighting, Ty.
Lighting's everything. It's
everything. Not rocket science. It's just where's the light and how does it look?
Yeah, you can look that up. True story about Carter Finley. But
it's sort of like with the Big House that they specifically cultivated a fan base that would never hurt your ears with the volume in the stadium, right?
Okay.
I always enjoy that. That it's just like, hey, everybody's real chill. You know, there's nobody rowdy here. Stadium's nice and wide open. It's a nice place to play.
We will get emails about this. We're gonna get emails and tweets about this. That's fine.
I am in a Michigan family.
You are.
This is all I have to listen to all the time. This is my social life, Ty. Michigan this, and I got this new piece of memorabilia, Michigan that. It's great.
All right. So look, this was a good show. I really appreciate Cory's time. He came on with us on short notice. Make sure you check him out and support him and the fine work he's doing over at Pack Pride. We will continue doing this over the next few episodes, we promise. Again, send in suggestions if you have any for other teams that you'd like us to focus on, teams that you might like to learn a little bit more about. We're working hard to try and line up interviews for the next week or so. Again, as we get to this point in late May, after we get through, let's say, Memorial Day, things start to pick up a little bit of steam.
Yeah.
Start to pick up a little bit of steam. It squarely at that point becomes the preseason. Right now, you could still get away with off season, but as we get into the preseason, we obviously have a lot of fun stuff planned here.
Making some travel plans. Yeah.
We have a lot of stuff on the docket ahead. So we're excited about the season ahead. It is going to pick up steam the deeper we get into this month and certainly as we get into the month of June. So if you're listening now, if you like what you heard, I know how these things work. I'm sure we have new NC State people who are listening to this show for the first time. We are a national show. but we do like to spend a fair amount of time talking about specific teams, learning about what makes them tick. If you like what makes us tick, hit follow, hit subscribe. That was a perfect professional segue there, Dan. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hit follow, hit subscribe wherever you're listening to us so that you don't miss any of our episodes. And of course, forballers.com is the Patreon if you want to get the ad-free episodes a little bit early, access to Discord, so on and so forth.
Can I give some life advice real quick before we sign off?
Life advice
as it relates to the college football season.
Oh, please.
Okay, so we are, I think, exactly 4 months out from September 21st. Is my math correct there?
I have no idea. I'm just going to
So May is the 5th month. September is the 9th month.
I don't do math. I'm going to take your word for it.
We can agree?
Sure, agreed.
We agree that May is the 5th month and September is the 9th month? I didn't think that was a controversial ask.
Correct.
So we're 4 months out from September 21st as we record this on May 21st.
We are 95 days out from the first college football game.
Yes, okay.
Inside 100
specifically, September 21st is when NC State travels to Clemson.
Correct.
Okay, this is when I would start speaking with your family, when I would start speaking with your significant other and say, hey, just a heads up, NC State's at Clemson on September 21st, and I don't know what sort of plans will come up, whatever, but that's a very important date to me to watch this huge football game, because as the date looms closer and you're like, oh, we're actually going out with my sister, or we actually have this this communion, this bar mitzvah, whatever, like, I told you in late May, I gave you notice. So just for your own safety, socially, personally, I don't think it's ever too soon to start circling dates on the calendar to give your significant other a heads up, because what you're doing is you're providing a service for both yourself and your loved ones. You're like, look, let's do whatever you want Friday the 20th. Let's do whatever you want the 22nd. But that's an important day to me that I don't miss. So I think right now is when you should start circling. Is that okay? Is that a reasonable bit of advice?
There are some fantastic games in week 4 as well. That's week 4 of the season.
You're talking about the 21st specifically?
USC at Michigan.
Great. I'm just saying, if it's week 9, if it's week 11, if it's week 2, whatever, look at your team's schedule and start giving notice about the big ones, the highlight matchups.
But I'm saying if you need to add a little bit more meat on the bone to support your case.
Tell me about September 21st.
It's not just NC State at Clemson, which figures to be a top 20 matchup, I think, if not better. You've got USC at Michigan, which is nothing if not interesting. We have the much ballyhooed Cal squaring off on the road at Florida State, their natural rival. Classic rivalry. We also have Tennessee at Oklahoma, which I think will be an interesting matchup to say the least. We've got a matchup elsewhere around college football in the Big 12, which I think is fascinating, like Kansas State at BYU, Utah at Oklahoma State.
Okay, if you're a Kansas State fan, you can do better than telling your significant other, I got to watch the BYU game. Like, watch the BYU game.
Kansas at West Virginia should be a pretty good game as well. I'm not going to recite all of these games, but I'm looking at the schedule, and I think this figures to be a really, really fun. UCLA at LSU. I don't have much hopes for LSU in that matchup, or for UCLA, in that matchup.
Beat them in the first part of that, the first leg, right?
But beat them in the first leg, yeah. So, look, this is the new world order of college football, where we've got all these teams that have clumped together in power conferences, and hopefully, if nothing more, I know we don't like to think of it in terms of TV revenue and ratings, and that's for people who are actually in the entertainment business, not Dan and I.
Sure.
But as a TV product, there are a lot of good TV games. There's a lot of interesting television this season ahead in college football, and week 4, I think, is no different. It's probably not as strong as some of the other weeks, but obviously, this is like one of the headliners, if not USC Michigan.
I am just now learning that LSU has both LA schools on the schedule and both USCs in September, South Carolina and USC. To me, Southern California is USC, but I'm sure people in South Carolina feel differently. That's pretty great. Good for LSU.
Big thanks again to Cory Smith. Check him out at packpride.com. Hit follow, hit subscribe wherever you are listening to Dan and I, so that you don't miss any of our episodes. Twice a week here.
Yes.
Until at some point in July, I think, when we'll switch it up to 3 a week and start getting you ready for the season. Mm-hmm. Many more episodes to come, though. Before we reach that point, hope to have you here with us for For that guy over there, my good friend Dan Rubenstein, for myself, Ty Hildenbrandt. Enjoy your weekend. Happy Memorial Day. We'll talk to you all on the flip side. Stay solid.
Peace.